An aerialist on a tightrope. Celine had seen death before. She was no stranger to the sight. But that did not make it any easier to bear witness to it now, nor did it make its finality any less severe. A life had been taken tonight. Like that, Annabelle was gone. Many realizations gripped Celine in the moments following the body's discovery. Annabelle had died a violent death. That much was clear from the jagged maw across her throat. Celine had never seen a wound like that. For an instant, she toyed with the idea that Bastien's snake might be responsible. Upon further consideration, however, it did not follow that a snake like Toussaint would go to the trouble of killing its prey, only to leave it behind in a darkened corridor. If memory served Celine correctly, pythons did not slash their victims' throats. Instead, they opted to squeeze the life out of them slowly. And of course, no snake would leave behind a calling card, written in blood, no less. But if the snake wasn't responsible for Annabelle's death, then who was? And why? Moreover, why had Annabelle come to Jacques tonight? Clearly she'd followed Celine and Pippa here, but why had she not made her presence known? It took only an instant for Celine to parse out the truth. The Mother Superior must have sent Annabelle to spy on them. It had to be the reason why the matron of the Ursuline convent had changed her mind so easily earlier this evening, when she'd suddenly granted Celine and Pippa permission to go, after protesting against it at length. Celine swallowed, her ears going hot. If the Mother Superior's machinations explained why Annabelle had come to Jacques tonight, it meant all of them. Pippa, the Mother Superior, and Celine herself had had a hand in Annabelle's violent death, in Annabelle's murder. Finally, if her death was at all related to the one along the docks, then it meant a madman or mad woman was on the loose. Celine's eyes shifted around the room slowly, her breaths quickening. If someone had murdered Annabelle in Jacques tonight following their arrival, it meant anyone present now, including all the members of La Cour des Lions, could be responsible for killing her. Odette, Nigel, Casimir, Arjun, the man from the Far East with the mother-of-pearl blade, the two ebony-skinned women with their bejeweled claws, Boone, the harried young server below, not to mention the many nameless individuals who'd been seated throughout the dimly lit chamber, and, of course, Bastien. With each passing second, these thoughts raced through Celine's mind, her skin tingling from the rush of blood, her foot tapping against the plush carpeting. In contrast, Pippa stared at the marble tabletop before them, her posture hollowing like an apple left out in the sun. It was nearing midnight. Celine and Pippa should have returned to the convent hours ago. Instead, they'd been sequestered in the shadowy chamber on the second floor, seated on an ornate divan in the style of Louis XIV, surrounded by a gathering of illusionists, as well as 5 members of the Metropolitan Police. Though it was the least of Celine's concerns, the Mother Superior would undoubtedly have their heads upon their return, but that could not be of issue now. Far more pressing was the fact that Pippa and Celine were likely being counted among the possible suspects in a murder. If Celine found any humor in the irony, she would be on the floor laughing maniacally. But humor would not save her now. Once the truth of Celine's and Pippa's association with Annabelle came to light, it would not be easy for them to explain why they'd been unaware of Annabelle's presence until the moment they discovered her body. Even to Celine, it sounded suspicious. Not only had they been nearby at the time of the victim's death, but they'd also known the poor young woman personally. Briefly, Celine considered trying to summon the Mother Superior to vouch for them. Alas, that old bat would be just as likely to foist blame onto Celine as she would be to help her. It was too much of a risk. Celine knew she should reveal these truths the instant after she was introduced to the Metropolitan Police's best detective. But it might color his judgment against them, causing him to forgo looking elsewhere for evidence. If she waited, however, he would undoubtedly be suspicious. Zut! Celine sighed to herself. When would be a good time to tell him? Never was definitely not an option. Was it? Alas, Celine could not conceal these things from him forever. Resentment swirled through her like a fog tinged in red light. Pippa began crying quietly, her fingers winding around one of the handkerchiefs Celine had fashioned to raise money for the convent. One of the many embroidered fripperies Annabel had sold Odette earlier that very day. How had it come to this? What kind of horrible misfortune had befallen Annabel? And why the devil had she acquiesced to the Mother Superior's wishes? Celine clenched her fist in her skirts, anger heating her blood. Tonight, the cost of Annabel's decision had been her life. Celine shook her head quickly, fending off the rising guilt, wishing to banish the image of Annabel's mauled body from her mind. Her efforts proved futile. Even in the few seconds before Pippa's scream and Odette's shout had torn through the night, before Bastien and Argent and Nigel had raced to their sides, the image of Annabel's death mask had seared itself forever onto Celine's eyelids. She glanced about, wondering how long the Metropolitan Police's most celebrated detective would take to question them. None of those waiting had yet to speak with him. Upon arrival, he'd gone straight to the place where Annabel's body had been found, and the semicircle of grim-faced officers standing around them did not exactly afford Celine a vantage point from which to discern much else. Across the way, Argent sat on a tufted velvet stool with an ankle crossed over a knee, his posture easy. From his fingers dangled a crystal tumbler, the contents within it swirling around the glass in shades of amber and gold. The monocle swaying from his throat shimmered as the whiskey danced about his glass. Celine urged her mind to become lost in the warm prisms cast by his motions. Better she lose herself in drink than look to her immediate right, toward the figure standing in the shadows, bereft of his revolver, glaring at nothing. Celine feigned a cough to clear her throat. Where was this cursed detective? Why was he taking so long to examine the scene of the crime? And where in God's name was Odette? Chaos had ensued in the moments following the discovery of Annabel's body. There hadn't been time for Celine to take stock of what was happening around her. Too many flashes of movements in all directions, too many questions crowding her mind. But now that a tense kind of calm had descended, an aerialist on a tightrope, several details struck Celine as odd. First, the only immediate reactions from the second floor had been those of herself, Pippa, and Odette. The only members of Le Coeur de Lions had kept strangely silent and still, as if murder was not at all a surprising event. It wasn't until everyone below reacted to the news that a gruesome death had occurred a stone's throw from where they sat that those on the second floor took action. Screams had echoed into the rafters, carrying from the restaurant into the streets. Women and men had fled the building, swelling into the alleyways and avenues adjoining Jacques. In the crush of shrieking bodies, Odette had disappeared without a word. At first, Celine and Pippa had worried something awful might have happened to her. They'd raced down the stairs toward the doors, searching the crowd for any sign of a young woman dressed as a man. By the time they'd made their way to the front of Jacques, all the exits had been cordoned off by the New Orleans Metropolitan Police. More than an hour later, Odette was still nowhere to be found. In fact, only a few members of Le Coeur de Lions were still present. Arjun, Bastian, Nigel, the man from the Far East, and the two women with the tantalizing rings. The rest had vanished into the night during the chaos. Celine knew Bastian could not avoid being interrogated. His family owned this establishment. It was only natural that he would be under immediate inquiry. At any moment, she fully expected his uncle, the Count, to stride into the room in a black silk cape and a plush fur top hat. Celine's mind churned in a ceaseless barrage of thoughts. Despite her best efforts to silence them, one continued rising to the forefront. The sight of Annabel's body troubled her immensely. Of course, the gaping wound at the girl's throat would likely haunt Celine for the rest of her days. But something else plagued her, remained just beyond her reach. The thud of a solid object echoed from below. The noise clattered down the stairs in staccato bursts of sound. Celine started. Pippa yelped softly. No one else uttered a word. The 5 officers of the Metropolitan Police cinched their semicircle tighter, drawing closer, like the strings of a purse pulling shut. Then they exchanged worried glances. Without warning, someone clapped their hands behind the waiting officers. The sound, loud and sudden, causing Pippa to cry out again and rekindling Celine's irritation. It prickled beneath her skin like 1,000 tiny needles threatening to burst forth. Arjun stopped swirling his drink. To his left, Nigel's frown hardened, the sight contrasting with his curling mustache, the tendons in his fingers flexing as if to keep him from lunging into the fray. Celine did not need to look at Bastian to know his anger had spiked, just as hers had. "My most profound apologies for keeping you waiting so long," a man calmly intoned, the sound desperate with the circumstances. "But I promise only one among you will be truly inconvenienced." The officers standing in a semicircle parted without preamble, revealing New Orleans' best police detective,